Hey everybody, and welcome back to Submarine History. Today, we're going to talk about the early fleet boats that the United States built to realize the goal of submarines operating with the fleet. Read the description to this briefing. It has relevant and related references and links. I have a Discord as well, and there's an invitation link on the channel banner. If you like the briefing, you can leave a super thanks or consider a channel membership. Your donation helps offset the cost of purchasing books, professional memberships, and software needed to write and record the briefings that you've come to enjoy and appreciate. Finally, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. Before we get into the meat of the briefing, I already know you're wondering, what is a fleet boat? In the generic sense, a fleet boat is a submarine purpose-built with the speed and endurance to travel and maneuver with a fleet in battle. Hence, fleet boat instead of coastal defense boat. Specifically for the U.S., this meant a submarine that could make 21 knots, which is what U.S. battleships were capable of at that time. I say specific to the U.S. because other countries had the goal of building boats that could keep up with their battle fleets or act as escorts for merchant shipping, things like that. Now, I find the whole timeline for U.S. submarines to be a little confusing. However, I finally found a way to compactly organize that timeline to make it clear the development path of U.S. submarines through World War II. This table has 3 columns, with each column denoting a category of subs that the U.S. built, as well as the classes that fall under that category. Example, the left column denotes the earliest submarines built by the U.S., the harbor defense boats. Listed are the classes of boats in alphabetical order, and the date listed denotes when the first hull in that class was laid down. So as you look at that column, you might notice that the laydown dates aren't chronological. Like the G class was first laid down in February 1909, but the E and F boats were laid down after the Gs. Each year, Congress approves the procurement of a certain number of boats for a given fiscal year, and there could be delays in getting a fiscal year boat building program going, for different reasons. And that would explain why the E and F boats, presumably approved before the G class, started construction after the Gs. Same table, but I've checked off the boats that we've covered so far. While we have a few more boats to cover in the coastal defense category, we're going to take a detour today and talk specifically about the T and V boat classes. These were the first fleet boats that the U.S. built. And here I've also shown where the T class forks off from the coastal boat development line. So for a period of time, the U.S. is going to be building 2 categories of boats, coastal defense and fleet. And this briefing will tell us how the fleet boats differed from the coastal defense boats and why they were desired. Now, in November 1911, there was an article in the British periodical Engineering about the electric boat submarines under development at the time. In the article was a sketch of a 17-knot, 950-ton submarine that was said to be under construction in Russia. In fact, what was described in the magazine was a class of 3 boats, the Russian Naval class, designed by Electric Boat and built by the Russians between 1911 and 1915. Now, in the briefing on the H-2O class boats, I mentioned that the H class was the last U.S. submarine design that Electric Boat could offer to other countries. That doesn't mean Electric Boat wasn't designing boats for other countries. They just couldn't offer any more designs that the U.S. was paying for. Also in that briefing on the H-2O class boats, we talked about how the General Board's early view of submarines and their role in combat was shaped by a 1909 presentation made by Electric Boat's Lawrence Spear. In that presentation, Spear emphasized to the General Board the benefits of smaller submarines over larger ones, mostly that a larger size hull doesn't make you less visible or more maneuverable, and that an increase in size doesn't necessarily increase your firepower. Spear's vision to the General Board was that submarines would remain small, less than 650 tons, and that they would either be deployed to a region with support ahead of time, or they would sail with the fleet at its economical speed of 11 knots, and then when the fleet got to where it was going, the subs and their tenders would set up base, and the subs would then take a defensive posture, protecting U.S. facilities. And by the way, it's interesting to note that the German Type 7A from 1935 was a little less than 650 ton surface displacement. Even though the General Board had an interest in submarines that could keep up and operate with the fleet, they initially bought into Speer's arguments. But then they became aware of that November 1911 magazine article. Here, Speer was pitching to the U.S. Navy small boats, while Electric Boat was designing something very different for European customers. And this caused concern that the U.S. had lost the lead in submarine innovation and development. Let's look at the difference between the H-class, a coastal submarine, which had started construction in March 1911, and the Russian Naval class, an ocean-going fleet submarine, which began construction in December of 1911. I'm not going to read through the tables today. You can stop the briefing and study them. What I want you to take away from this table is that the Naval class was more than twice the size in terms of displacement and about 40% longer than the H-class. The maximum surface speed is up 3 knots to 17 knots, and the maximum submerged speed is 11 knots, which is similar to the H-class. The Naval still had a hydrodynamic shape well suited for underwater travel, and that probably held them back from achieving a higher surface speed. So U.S. Navy submariners had been expressing dissatisfaction with the boats that they were getting. When given the chance to comment on the characteristics of the proposed K-class boats in April of 1911, 7 months before the British magazine article comes out, they let the Atlantic Fleet chain of command know about their dissatisfactions. They, the submariners, they wanted 21-inch torpedo tubes instead of 18-inch tubes, since that's what U.S. destroyers were getting at the time. They wanted independent caps for each torpedo tube so that all 4 could be fired and reloaded in quick sequence. They wanted ballast tanks that could fill faster and a greater cruising range, among other things. They wanted bigger boats. In January of 1912, the Secretary of the Navy, George Mayer, he reacted to these concerns by forming a board of submarine officers to review submarine design and construction policy. This was the Submarine Flotilla Board. Having created the board, its first task was to propose a fleet boat that eventually led to the T and V class submarines. So this would not be the first time the U.S. had studied the feasibility of a fleet boat. Before the creation of the Submarine Flotilla Board in 1912, U.S. submarine officers had been voicing their concerns about the performance and quality of their boats to the General Board through the commander of the Atlantic Torpedo Flotilla. In August 1910, the submariners would ask for the following. Number 1, higher speeds, 18 knots surfaced, 14 knots submerged. 2, larger hulls with more compartmentalization. Why? More watertight compartments make a boat safer. It isolates engine room noise from the control room. It allows the centralized supervision of major valves in one location, the control room. And it increases the volume of stores carried to extend loiter time. The Bureau of Construction and Repair then went to their contractors, Electric Boat, Lake, and Laurenti, for their input on the submariners' ideas for a fleet boat. And this was the feedback the contractors gave. 1, a higher speed requires a ship-shaped hull, which kills submerged speed. And 2, a fast submarine would be twice the size of the H-boats, implying twice the cost. So eventually, Laurenti would offer to design and build a fleet boat on a $1 million budget, which at the time was twice what the U.S. was paying for the smaller boats under construction at the time. Well, based on that cost, the Navy's chief constructor rejected the proposal, and at least for a while, the idea of the fleet boat died away. But this is what Laurenti offered the U.S. Navy. A 20-knot surface speed and 10 knots submerged, 214-foot length with a 20-foot beam, 750 tons surfaced, 900 tons submerged, a 6,000 nautical mile surface range, and a 95 nautical mile submerged range. This boat is similar to the Naval class that Electric Boat was designing for the Russians. And it's interesting to note that Laurenti's position was that you don't need an underwater speed greater than 10 knots, since higher speeds impact periscope use. No one thought that you might want a higher underwater speed to, say, escape an enemy. But there were a lot of things about submarines that really won't become apparent until World War I. Okay, back to 1912. The General Board had become aware that, in Europe, the trend in submarine design was moving towards what we call the fleet boat, a submarine with high surface speed that could run with the fleet and even possibly replace destroyers as a type in combat. In the fall of 1912, the War College decides to test a notional fleetboat in a series of war games. There was interest to see if submarines could be a counter to the battlecruiser, which was in service with the European navies. This is what the fleetboat employment strategy as the War College saw it. Submarines will operate with the fleet. They will act as a mobile minefield or smart mines ahead of an enemy fleet. They will try to limit the ability of an enemy fleet to maneuver, and they will try to limit the ability of an enemy fleet to coordinate fire. However, the War College did this based on a set of submarine capabilities that didn't exist at the time. They assumed that their notional submarine could achieve a 30-knot speed, surface speed, would have 8 torpedo tubes, and torpedoes with a 6,000-yard range. And the War College also didn't take into account how foul weather would impact a fleetboat's ability to keep up and maneuver with the fleet. Results of the wargaming showed that submarines could have an impact on the battle space, but there was a lingering problem that was never fully addressed or resolved. And that problem was, assuming your enemy also had submarines, how would you distinguish friend from foe in combat? Another problem that wasn't addressed through the war games was submarine speed. The U.S. didn't have diesel engines big enough to drive a submarine anywhere near the goal of 21 knots, let alone 30 knots. Last, submarine dive time was still incredibly long, taking 5 to 15 minutes to submerge, depending if the boat was fully serviced or running awash. There was a lot of back and forth between the General Board, the Bureau of Construction and Repair, and the War College over these issues. Steam was being used in Europe to achieve high surface speeds, but the boats took a long time to get up to speed, and it made a boat's interior incredibly hot. So these issues were kicked around for a few years before Spear and the Electric Boat Company came to the Navy's rescue in fiscal year 15. And this is the fleet boat that Electric Boat offered the Navy, the T-class. These boats were way bigger than anything that had been built to date. 1,106 tons surfaced, 1,487 tons submerged, and 268 feet long. Now, I had said earlier that the U.S. didn't have diesel engines that could propel a submarine anywhere near 21 knots. Spear solved this problem by putting 2 diesels in tandem on each shaft, and this put the theoretical maximum surface speed at 20 knots. Twin trainable torpedo tubes were used because U.S. torpedoes at the time couldn't be set to make course changes after firing, so having trainable mounts allowed the sub to make off-angled shots at targets instead of being perpendicular to the target. These 3 boats would be built between 1916 and 1919. They were considered unsuccessful because the tandem diesels were subject to torsional stress, vibration, and there were engine alignment issues on the shafts. They would all be decommissioned by 1923. The T3 would be recommissioned briefly to test different engines, but it was finally taken out of service by 1927. Even as the first T-class was being laid down in 1916, the U.S. was already looking at the next generation of fleet boats. This would be the V-class that was authorized in 1916, but wouldn't start construction until after World War I in 1921. The V-class was an interesting mix of 9 boats with different specifications. V1 through V3 were the fleet boats. V4 was a mine layer. V5 and V6 were long-range cruising submarines. And another set of fleet boats, V7 through V9, although they were smaller than the V1 through V3. The V4 through V9s wouldn't begin construction until 1925, 4 years after the first 3 V-class boats were laid down. So as you look at the profile of the V1 on the slide, you can see a long, slender hull with a bulbous clipper bow. It's really starting to look like a Gato-class boat, which is what an American would think of when you're talking about fleet boats. Another table, and here we see the V1 is twice the displacement of the T-class and 27% longer. They had 1 diesel per shaft, and those 2 diesels developed 1,000 more horsepower than the tandem diesels used on the Ts. So by 1921, it's clear that much bigger diesel engines were available. These boats also had auxiliary diesels that were meant for charging the batteries, but in a pinch, their power could be added to the main diesels, and that's what gets these V-boats to that goal of 21 knots. Unfortunately, like the T-class, these boats suffered from unreliable power plants, and they couldn't make their design speeds surfaced or submerged. In spite of the bulbous bow to improve seakeeping, they still handled poorly even with modifications. They would be decommissioned by 1937 and then reactivated for World War II and converted to be cargo subs during the war, but they ended up only being used in a training role. Now this last slide here is a quick comparison of the T1 and the V1 to the German Type 9C and the US Gato. The Type 9C, built 24 years after the T-class, is dimensionally similar, and their power plant output is also close. 15 years after the V1 was built, we see a similar comparison of dimensions and power plant output between the Gato and the V1. And that's it for today's briefing. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave your questions and comments below. Come over to the Submarine History Discord and say hi. Till next time, peace out.